Good evening, good morning, or perhaps good why am I still awake at this ridiculous hour? Wherever you are, and whenever you are, welcome. You have chosen, wisely or accidentally, to drift through the history of Great Britain. This is a land of foggy islands and rain-soaked hills, of eccentric monarchs, improbable inventions, and people who consider queuing a national sport. A land that has given the world Shakespeare, the steam engine, and, with only slightly less pride, the sandwich. Our task tonight is to travel across the centuries, all of them, from the first hunter-gatherers chasing mammoths to Brexit debates and beyond. We'll move slowly, gently, like a stroll through a country lane. Along the way, you'll encounter Druids, Romans, Vikings, Knights, Tudors, Puritans, Victorians, and perhaps the occasional confused Frenchman. But do not worry, there will be no pop quizzes, no exams at the end. You need only listen, or half listen, or perhaps not listen at all. If you drift off to sleep halfway through the Norman Conquest, I promise William the Conqueror will forgive you. Why tell the history of Britain in this way? Because Britain's story is at once utterly extraordinary and deeply ordinary. Extraordinary in its moments of drama, battles, revolutions, inventions. Ordinary in its continuity, the endless rhythm of fields, villages and people muddling along. And also because, frankly, it's rather fun. Now, a word about style. I shall do my best to keep the pace gentle. Think of me not as a lecturer hammering away with bullet points, but as a friendly guide who occasionally wanders off on tangents. Tangents, after all, are what make history human. The odd aside about tea, a cheeky observation about Henry VIII's matrimonial enthusiasm, a small reminder that medieval kings spent half their time with toothache. These details make the grand sweep of history feel less like a textbook and more like a bedtime story. Our story will be told century by century, with no gaps, no leaps too large. Every period has its tale, every century its characters. Some centuries are noisy, wars, plagues, revolutions. Others are quieter. But even in the quieter ones, history was ticking away, shaping the world we live in. So, what lies ahead? We shall begin in the mists of prehistory, when the first humans tramped across Doggerland into what would one day become England. Then to the Romans, with their baths and sandals, their straight roads and occasional massacres. Then the Saxons and the Vikings, the Normans and the Plantagenets, knights, castles, cathedrals, all jostling for your drowsy attention. We'll pass through the Tudors, 6 wives, one gigantic ego, then stumble through the Stuarts with their wars and Puritan killjoys. We'll rise with the Georgians, steam with the Victorians, and fight through 2 world wars, before arriving, slightly breathless, in the modern day. All of that awaits you, but there is no rush. Tonight you may hear it all, or perhaps just the first chapter or 2 before sleep claims you. Either way, Britain will still be here in the morning. So, settle in, lie back, adjust the pillow, sip your tea if you have one, and let your eyelids grow heavy. Britain's story begins not with kings or queens, but with ice, stone, and silence. A small island in the corner of the world, waiting for history to begin. Shall we? Let us step back in time, Not a little step, mind you, not to the Tudors or even the Romans. We're taking a very large, rather chilly step all the way to the end of the last Ice Age. Imagine, if you will, Britain without Britain. No Tower of London, no Shakespeare, no fish and chips. Instead, great hulking glaciers. Miles of ice pressing down on the land like some inattentive god had dropped a giant ice cube tray over northern Europe and forgotten to pick it up again. Around 12,000 years ago, the ice finally began to retreat. As it did, the land emerged. Scrubby, windswept, a little bleak, and populated by the sort of animals you only see in museums today. Mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, and great shaggy beasts lumbered across the tundra. Early humans crept in behind them, clutching stone tools, hoping desperately that mammoth steaks were easier to chew than they looked. And here's the first curious thing. Back then, Britain wasn't even an island. If you wanted to, you could walk, yes, walk, from what is now Norfolk all the way to Denmark. No EasyJet, no Ryanair, not even a ferry, just a vast stretch of land called Doggerland, which joined Britain to the continent. These first settlers, Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, could wander freely, chasing red deer in forests of birch and pine, fishing in the rivers and, if they were especially bold, strolling all the way to what is now Belgium. Doggerland was, by all accounts, rather a good place to live. Fertile plains, rivers, lakes, and a handy bridge to the rest of Europe. Sadly, it had one major drawback. As the ice sheets melted, the sea levels rose. Slowly, inexorably, the waters crept higher, swallowing fields, forests, and eventually the entire land bridge. One day you were walking to France, the next you'd need a boat. And so Britain became an island, a state of affairs that has continued to complicate British-European relations ever since. By around 4000 BC, Britain's people were no longer just wandering hunters. They had begun to farm. Sheep, goats and cattle appeared in the fields, and cereal crops were planted. This was the Neolithic Age, the New Stone Age. The shift from hunting to farming was revolutionary. Instead of endlessly chasing your dinner across the countryside, you could now pen it in a field and fatten it up at your leisure. Convenience food, prehistoric style. And farming had other consequences. With permanent settlements came buildings. Villages grew up, fields were enclosed, and communities began to think in terms of ours and yours, always a recipe for mischief. People also began to think rather big when it came to monuments. Enter Britain's most famous pile of rocks, Stonehenge. Stonehenge, standing on Salisbury Plain, was begun around 3000 BC and tinkered with for the next 1,500 years. Nobody knows exactly why it was built. A temple? A calendar? A place for midsummer parties? Whatever its purpose, it required dragging enormous stones, some weighing as much as 25 tons, from as far away as Wales. Quite why Neolithic Britons felt compelled to haul half a mountain across the countryside is anyone's guess. Perhaps they were simply bored. After all, this was an age before Netflix. Stonehenge wasn't alone. Across Britain, other stone circles, henges and burial mounds appeared. Silbury Hill, for instance, near Avebury, is the largest prehistoric mound in Europe, essentially a Neolithic skyscraper, though with fewer lifts and slightly more chalk. These monuments remind us that prehistoric people weren't primitive dullards. They had imagination, organisation, and a flair for the dramatic. Around 2500 BC, Britain entered the Bronze Age. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, was tougher than stone, shinier and rather fashionable. The Cornish, blessed with tin in abundance, became major exporters. Trade routes stretched across Europe, and Britain was not as cut off as one might think. Imagine small boats braving the seas, laden with metal, amber, and perhaps a passenger or two, clutching a strange accent and a peculiar taste for olive oil. Bronze Age Britons lived in roundhouses, simple huts of wood, wattle, and thatch. They farmed, raised livestock, and buried their dead in barrows, often with grave goods, jewellery, tools, weapons. Perhaps the prehistoric equivalent of being buried with your favourite iPhone. These burials tell us much about their beliefs, a sense of an afterlife, a respect for status and, judging by the amount of jewellery, a fondness for bling. By around 800 BC, the Iron Age had arrived. Iron was easier to find than tin and copper and made stronger weapons. With iron tools came more efficient farming, larger settlements, and, inevitably, more wars. Britain was now divided among numerous tribes, each with its own chief, warriors, and traditions. They built hill forts, great defended settlements on high ground encircled with ditches and banks. Some were small, others vast, bustling with hundreds of people. If you've ever walked up to Maiden Castle in Dorset, you'll know how impressive and exhausting these places still are. The tribes of Iron Age Britain were part of the broader Celtic world. They spoke Celtic languages, created intricate art, and, at least according to later writers, painted themselves blue with woad before battle. Whether this made them terrifying or merely chilly is unclear. The Celts had druids, mysterious priests who apparently knew the secrets of nature, religion, and perhaps how to find misty groves at just the right dramatic moment. Julius Caesar, who later encountered them, claimed the druids practiced human sacrifice, which may have been Roman propaganda or may explain why mistletoe still makes some people nervous. These tribes traded across Europe. Coins appeared in southern Britain by the 2nd century BC, some with images of horses, others abstract patterns that look suspiciously like doodles. Britain was not isolated. It was plugged into a continental network of trade, culture, and ideas. By the 1st century BC, Britain was a lively patchwork of tribes, some farming peacefully, others raiding neighbours, many jostling for power. And across the Channel, in Gaul, a new force was watching. Rome. An empire with roads, legions, and a worrying habit of invading places. It is here that Britain's prehistory ends. For when Julius Caesar peered across the waters in 55 BC, he saw not just an island, but an opportunity. And though his first forays were brief, they marked the beginning of an entirely new chapter. The island that had once been linked to Europe by Doggerland would now be tied to it by conquest, law, and empire. So, let us pause here. Britain, on the eve of Roman conquest, was a land of hill forts and druids, painted warriors and stone circles. Its people were farmers, traders, and warriors. They had tamed the land, built monuments that still baffle us, and developed cultures rich in art and belief. They were, in short, ready for their close-up in history. And in the next chapter, history will indeed come marching ashore, to the steady beat of Roman sandals. If Britain's prehistory was misty, mysterious, and vaguely druid-shaped, the Romans arrive like a marching band at a funeral, noisy, organised, and absolutely determined to make their presence felt. The Romans, of course, were the superpower of the ancient world. They had legions, aqueducts, concrete, and the sort of self-confidence that makes you invade other people's islands simply because you can. Britain, from Rome's perspective, was a slightly damp afterthought, a land of painted barbarians, bad weather, and tin mines. Julius Caesar had dipped his sandals in British mud as early as 55 BC, but he quickly scurried back across the Channel, having achieved little except terrifying a few tribes and inventing the phrase Veni, Vidi, Vici, and then I left because it was raining. The real invasion came nearly a century later, in AD 43, under Emperor Claudius. Now, Claudius was not your stereotypical dashing conqueror. He was bookish, had a limp, and rather enjoyed mushrooms, possibly too much, given how he eventually died. But what Claudius lacked in personal glamour, he made up for in imperial ambition. Sending 4 legions to Britain, he ensured Rome's grip would be firmer than Caesar's muddy footprints. The invasion force landed in Kent, and after the usual bloodshed, bribery, and general Roman efficiency, they marched inland. Tribal resistance was fierce, but the Romans had discipline, armour, and, most importantly, a gift for turning enemies into allies. Local rulers who cooperated were rewarded. Those who resisted often found themselves nailed to something unpleasant. By AD 47, much of southern Britain was under Roman control. Towns began to appear, built not of wattle and daub, but of stone and brick. Roads, glorious straight Roman roads, sliced across the landscape, connecting forts and settlements. If you ever wondered why so many British motorways run dead straight for miles before abruptly crashing into a roundabout, you can thank the Romans for the first part and modern planning departments for the second. But conquest was never smooth. One of the most famous eruptions of resistance came in AD 60. Enter Boudica, queen of the Iceni tribe. Wronged by the Romans, her husband's kingdom stolen, her daughters assaulted, Boudica raised a rebellion of terrifying scale. With fiery speeches, wild hair, and a chariot bristling with scythes, she led her warriors in burning Roman towns, including Londinium. For a brief, terrifying moment, Roman Britain teetered. But the legions regrouped, discipline triumphed, and Boudica's revolt was crushed. Her death, whether by poison, illness, or simply despair, ended the uprising, but her legend has never faded. Today, a great statue of Boudica still glowers beside the Thames, as if daring the Houses of Parliament to try anything silly. Over the next decades, Rome pushed north and west. Wales was conquered with brutal determination. The Druids at Anglesey, guardians of Celtic religion, were massacred. In the north, the Romans advanced deep into Scotland, building forts as far as the Highlands. But holding Scotland proved tricky. The locals, Picts, fierce and uncooperative, had no intention of submitting. And so, in AD 122, Emperor Hadrian ordered the construction of a wall. Hadrian's wall stretched across northern England, from coast to coast, 73 miles of stone and turf, dotted with forts, mile castles and ditches. It marked the edge of Rome's empire, a line saying, "Beyond this, barbarians, sheep, and not much else." Even today, the ruins of the wall march across the landscape, a reminder of Roman ambition and the stubbornness of northern tribes. Life in Roman Britain, however, was not all walls and wars. For many it meant towns with baths, forums and markets, villas with mosaics and underfloor heating, a considerable improvement over smoky huts. Latin inscriptions began to appear, temples to Roman gods were built, and Christianity even arrived by the 3rd century. Yet Romanization was never complete. In rural areas, many Britons clung to old customs, speaking Celtic languages and worshipping their own gods alongside Jupiter and Mars. The economy flourished. Britain exported grain, metal and slaves. In return came wine, olive oil, pottery, and all the trappings of Mediterranean civilization. Imagine a Celtic farmer in Cornwall suddenly drinking Italian wine, probably wondering why it didn't taste like decent mead. But empires, like insomniacs, cannot last forever. By the late 4th century, Rome was weakening. Pressures on the empire mounted. Invasions, internal strife, emperors who were more interested in intrigue than governance. In Britain, Roman rule began to fray. Troops were withdrawn to defend Gaul. Local officials were left to fend off Saxon raiders. The grand villas fell into disrepair. In AD 410, Rome finally abandoned Britain. The Emperor Honorius told the Britons they were on their own. The imperial equivalent of changing the locks and leaving no forwarding address. Suddenly, after nearly 400 years of baths, roads and legions, Britain was left without Rome. And so, Roman Britain ended. Some towns lingered, some customs survived, but the empire's guiding hand was gone. In its place came uncertainty, chaos, and the slow drift into what we call the Dark Ages. Though, for the people living through it, I imagine it was simply Tuesday. Thus, as the legions marched away, Britain faced a new chapter. Exposed to raids, divided among tribes, and waiting for the arrival of Saxons, Vikings, and other enthusiasts with sharp objects. But for now, let us pause with Hadrian's Wall crumbling, the villas abandoned, and Britain alone once more. When the Romans packed up and left Britain around AD 410, they didn't exactly leave a note on the kitchen table saying, "Good luck, we'll pop back in later." They simply vanished. One day, Roman officials, soldiers and tax collectors were a fact of life. The next, they were gone. Villas began to crumble, roads went to weeds, and towns emptied. For many Britons, life must have felt like waking up to find your landlord gone, the heating turned off, and a gang of strangers eyeing up your front garden. Into this vacuum came the Anglo-Saxons. These were Germanic tribes, Angles, Saxons and Jutes from what is now Denmark and northern Germany. According to later legend, Britain's leaders even invited some of them in as mercenaries to help fight off other raiders, which, with hindsight, was a bit like hiring foxes to guard your chickens. Very soon, the mercenaries decided they rather liked Britain's green fields and stayed on permanently. By the 6th century, the Anglo-Saxons had carved the land into small kingdoms. Historians call this the Heptarchy, 7 main realms, including Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, Kent, Sussex, Essex, and East Anglia. The borders shifted constantly, of course, as kings fought, schemed, and occasionally married their way to temporary dominance. Anglo-Saxon Britain looked very different from Roman Britain. Out went the villas, mosaics and baths. In came wooden halls, small villages, and an agricultural lifestyle. Yet it wasn't all gloom. The Anglo-Saxons brought their own culture, a rich language, the roots of English, poetry like Beowulf, and a love of mead-fuelled feasts. Their kings ruled from great timber halls, where warriors pledged loyalty in exchange for gifts, gold arm rings, weapons, and the occasional boar-shaped helmet. Religion, too, shifted. At first, the Anglo-Saxons worshipped pagan gods, Woden, Thunor, and Tiv. Our days of the week still carry their names: Wednesday, Thursday, Tuesday. But in the 6th and 7th centuries, Christianity returned. Missionaries like St. Augustine, sent from Rome in 597, landed in Kent and converted kings and their courts. Monasteries sprang up, centres of learning, prayer, and occasionally very good beer. By the 8th century, Anglo-Saxon monasteries produced illuminated manuscripts like the Lindisfarne Gospels, dazzlingly beautiful creations that still survive today. But history never allows Britain to be peaceful for long. Just as the Anglo-Saxons settled in, new raiders appeared on the horizon: the Vikings. From the late 8th century onwards, longships began sliding up British rivers, carrying Norsemen from Denmark and Norway. At first, they came to raid, swooping down on monasteries like Lindisfarne in 793, stealing treasure and terrifying monks. But soon, like the Saxons before them, the Vikings decided Britain wasn't just a nice place to loot. It was a nice place to live. The 9th century saw the Vikings settle in large swathes of Britain. The Danelaw was established, an area of eastern and northern England under Viking control, with its own laws and customs. Place names ending in -by, like Derby, Grimsby and Whitby, mark where they settled. Norse words seeped into English, words like sky, egg and knife. Even our sense of humour, some might argue, still carries a whiff of Viking bluntness. This was not a happy arrangement for the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Constant warfare raged between Saxons and Vikings. At one point, it seemed the entire island might fall under Norse rule. Enter Alfred the Great, King of Wessex, 871 to 899. Alfred faced defeat after defeat early in his reign. At one point, he was reduced to hiding in the marshes of Somerset, famously burning some cakes he'd been asked to watch over. But Alfred rallied. He reorganised his army, built a navy, and constructed fortified towns, burhs, across his kingdom. In 878, at the Battle of Edington, Alfred defeated the Vikings and forced their leader Guthrum to accept baptism and retreat. Alfred's victory saved part of England from conquest. More than that, he laid the foundations of something new, the idea of a single English kingdom. He promoted learning, translated Latin texts into English, and encouraged education. His successors continued the fight, gradually expanding Wessex's influence over other Anglo-Saxon realms. By the 10th century, England was beginning to look like one unified kingdom. Kings like Athelstan, reigned 924 to 939, ruled not just Wessex, but all England. He is often considered the first true king of England, yet unity was fragile. The Vikings never entirely went away. Fresh waves of raiders, now from Denmark and later from Norway, returned in the late 10th and early 11th centuries. Some even managed to seize the crown itself. In 1016, the Danish king Canute became ruler of England. But that takes us into another chapter. For now, we leave Britain in the 10th century. Anglo-Saxon in culture, Viking in influence, Christian in religion, and restless in politics. A land of warrior kings, monks with pens, and villagers still nervously scanning the horizon for sails. The Roman order was gone. In its place stood a patchwork kingdom forged in battle and belief that would one day call itself England. History has a way of pivoting on a single year, and for England, that year is 1066. It's the sort of date schoolchildren are forced to memorize, often without quite remembering why. But if Britain's history were a soap opera, 1066 would be the dramatic season finale. New characters, new sets, and a whole new set of feuds. When Edward the Confessor, King of England, died childless in January of that year, the kingdom faced a problem. No heir. Cue a scramble for the throne. Three men fancied themselves the rightful king. First, Harold Godwinson, the most powerful noble in England, who was duly crowned by the local establishment. Second, Harold Hardrada, King of Norway, who thought that long ago promises and Viking muscle gave him a claim. And third, William, Duke of Normandy, across the Channel, who insisted Edward had once promised him the crown over a particularly awkward dinner conversation. The result? A year of battles. In September, Harold Hardrada invaded from Norway. Harold Godwinson rushed north and defeated him at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, a stunning victory that effectively ended the Viking Age. But Harold barely had time to catch his breath before William of Normandy landed in Sussex. At the Battle of Hastings on the 14th of October 1066, the Normans and the Anglo-Saxons fought all day. Harold's army held firm until late afternoon, when, according to legend, Harold was struck in the eye with an arrow. Whether or not the arrow story is true, Harold fell, his army broke, and William was victorious. Within weeks, William was crowned King of England, earning the rather blunt nickname the Conqueror. And what a conquest it was! The Normans wasted no time reshaping England. Castles sprouted everywhere, great stone keeps like the Tower of London, looming over towns as both fortress and symbol of power. Cathedrals, too, vast Romanesque structures of stone, replaced the simpler wooden churches of the Anglo-Saxons. The very landscape seemed to change, as though England had been put under new management. Language shifted too. The Anglo-Saxons spoke Old English, the ancestor of modern English, but thicker, earthier, and frankly impenetrable to us today. The Normans spoke Old French. For centuries after 1066, England's elite chattered away in French, while peasants muttered in English. The result was a curious blend. French words of sophistication layered over English roots. This is why we say cow when it's in the field, but beef when it's on the plate, sheep in the meadow, but mutton on the table. The peasants raised the animals, the nobles ate them. Vocabulary has never been more honest. The Normans were also keen on bookkeeping. In 1086, William ordered the Domesday Book, a vast survey of England's land, people and resources. Every field, every pig, every village was recorded. For historians, it's a goldmine. For peasants at the time, it was probably rather irritating. Imagine trying to explain to a royal official exactly how many sheep you owned, only for them to scribble it down with suspicious enthusiasm. Power in Norman England was centralised. Feudalism took firm root. The king granted land to his barons, who granted it to knights, who oversaw peasants, who did most of the actual work. Life, for the majority, was hard, muddy, and short. But for the elite, it was a time of opportunity, titles, castles, and the occasional thrilling chance to rebel, usually followed by a swift hanging. The 12th century saw England settle into this new Norman order, though not without drama. William's sons squabbled over the crown, as brothers do. Henry I, one of William's sons, secured the throne but faced a succession crisis when his only legitimate son drowned in the White Ship disaster of 1120. His daughter Matilda was named heir, but many barons weren't keen on the idea of a woman ruling. The result was decades of civil war known as the Anarchy, 1135 to 1154. On one side, Matilda and her supporters, on the other, her cousin, Stephen. Castles were besieged, loyalties shifted like the British weather, and chroniclers moaned that Christ and his saints slept, which is medieval shorthand for everything was a bit of a disaster. Eventually, compromise was reached. Stephen would remain king, but Matilda's son Henry would inherit after him. And so it was that in 1154 the throne passed to Henry II, first of the Plantagenets, ushering in a new royal dynasty and a fresh chapter in England's medieval saga. Meanwhile, Scotland and Wales were busy writing their own medieval tales. Scotland's kings worked to expand their authority north and south, often colliding with their English neighbours. Wales remained fiercely independent, its mountains harbouring princes like Llywelyn the Great, who resisted English encroachment with considerable success. The story of Britain in the 12th century was not simply English, but a patchwork of competing realms, each with ambitions and grievances. So, by the end of the 12th century, what had the Normans achieved? They had transformed England's politics, language, and architecture. They had imported castles, cathedrals, and an enduring love of legal documents. They had produced a system of government more centralised than anything the Anglo-Saxons had dreamed of. And they had laid the foundations for centuries of conflict between kings, barons, and occasionally very irritable peasants. For now, the Normans had conquered and reshaped England. But the medieval world was only just warming up. Ahead lay Magna Carta, crusades, plague, and the kind of dynastic squabbles that make modern politics look positively tranquil. By the beginning of the 13th century, England had settled into the rule of the Plantagenet kings. Castles dotted the hillsides, cathedrals rose like stone prayers to heaven, and the rhythm of daily life carried on much as it had for centuries. Peasants working the fields, nobles hunting in forests, and kings endlessly worrying about France. Yet beneath this picture of stability was a simmering unease that would soon come to a head in a meadow beside the River Thames. King John, son of Henry II and brother of Richard the Lionheart, is remembered as one of the least loved monarchs England ever endured. Unlucky in war, prone to losing territory in France, perpetually at odds with his nobles, and not blessed with charm, John managed the remarkable feat of uniting almost everyone in dislike of him. By 1215, his barons had had enough. They forced him to Runnymede, where, Under protest, he set his seal on the Magna Carta. He had no real intention of honouring it, of course, but the symbolism was lasting. For the first time, it was written that the king himself was subject to the law, an idea that would echo down through the centuries. John's successors fared somewhat better, though not without turbulence. His son, Henry III, endured a long reign, while Edward I, tall and formidable, earned a reputation as a fearsome warrior. Edward stamped his authority on Wales with a ring of mighty castles that still dominate the landscape today, and he turned his attention northwards to Scotland, where resistance came in the form of men like William Wallace and Robert the Bruce. The struggle for Scottish independence became one of the defining stories of the late medieval age. At the same time, English kings were entangled with France. The long and costly Hundred Years' War began in 1337, when Edward III, in a fit of dynastic ambition, claimed the French throne. The French were not impressed. What followed was more than a century of conflict, with longbowmen cutting down armoured knights at Crécy and Poitiers, English kings briefly ruling over swathes of France, and fortunes rising and falling like the tide. The English had their moments of glory, but ultimately France, stirred by figures such as Joan of Arc, drove them out, leaving England with little more than Calais. While England fought abroad, calamity struck at home. In 1347, the Black Death arrived, carried on ships and spreading with terrifying speed. Villages emptied, churches struggled to bury the dead, and perhaps a third of the population perished. For survivors, life was never the same. With labour scarce, peasants found their bargaining power increased, and the rigid old feudal order began to crack. In 1381, the discontent boiled over in the Peasants' Revolt, when thousands marched on London demanding freedom from serfdom and the burden of unfair taxes. The rebellion was crushed, but the system of lord and serf would never quite recover. The 15th century brought yet more upheaval, this time at the very heart of the monarchy. Rival branches of the royal family, the Lancasters and the Yorks, descended into civil war. The Wars of the Roses were a dynastic struggle marked by battles, betrayals, and shifting loyalties. Kings came and went with alarming speed. Edward IV seized the crown. Henry VI regained it, only for Edward to take it back again. It was chaos worthy of Shakespeare, who later turned the saga into a drama of ghosts and vengeance. The final act of this bloody quarrel came in 1485 at Bosworth Field. Richard III, last of the Plantagenets, was defeated and killed by Henry Tudor, who claimed the throne as Henry VII. With him began a new dynasty, the Tudors, and a new chapter of England's story. Richard III, last of the Plantagenets, was defeated and killed by Henry Tudor, who claimed the throne as Henry VII. With him began a new dynasty, the Tudors, and a new chapter of England's story. Elsewhere in Britain, Scotland under Robert the Bruce and his successors fought to maintain independence, while Wales, subdued by Edward I's conquest, lived under English domination, but preserved its language and culture. The island was still a patchwork of identities and rivalries, but change was coming fast. By the year 1500, the medieval world was fading. Castles and cathedrals still stood, but gunpowder had arrived, printing presses were beginning to spread ideas, and the stirrings of the Renaissance were felt even in this damp corner of Europe. The stage was set for the Tudors, a family who would bring spectacle, scandal, and transformation. The Tudors begin, as so many royal dynasties do, with a battle and a body in the mud. In 1485, at Bosworth Field, Henry Tudor defeated Richard III and claimed the throne as Henry VII. He was not by anyone's measure the most dazzling of kings. Cautious, calculating, and careful with money, Henry had the charisma of a tax inspector and the outlook of a man who always counted his spoons after a dinner guest left. Yet he was exactly what the kingdom needed. After decades of civil war, he brought peace, order, and a much-needed sense of stability. He married Elizabeth of York, uniting the warring houses of Lancaster and York, and set about rebuilding royal authority. England at last could breathe. But it was his son Henry VIII who would thrust the Tudors into the history books. When young Henry came to the throne in 1509, he was everything his father was not: handsome, athletic, cultured, and bursting with energy. He hunted, jousted, composed music, and wrote poetry. At first he seemed the very model of a Renaissance prince. But time would reveal his defining flaw: an insatiable appetite for power, for pleasure, and for heirs. His marriages, 6 of them, became the stuff of legend, each a chapter in a story of obsession, politics, and tragedy. The first was Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess and the widow of Henry's older brother. For 24 years they were married, but Catherine bore him only one surviving child, a daughter, Mary. Henry, desperate for a son, grew restless. He sought an annulment, but the Pope, under pressure from Catherine's nephew, the formidable Emperor Charles V, refused. And so Henry took matters into his own hands. His second wife was Anne Boleyn, witty, sharp, and ambitious. To marry her, Henry broke from Rome, declaring himself head of the Church of England. Monasteries were dissolved, their wealth seized, and England lurched into religious revolution. Anne gave Henry a daughter, Elizabeth, but no son. Accused of adultery and treason, she was executed at the Tower of London. Jane Seymour followed, Henry's third wife. Gentle and compliant, she gave Henry his longed-for son Edward, but she died soon after childbirth, leaving Henry heartbroken, though not, it must be said, single for long. Anne of Cleves was next, chosen for diplomatic reasons. Henry, on meeting her, declared she looked nothing like her flattering portrait, and had the marriage swiftly annulled. He called her his sister, though one suspects neither was terribly fond of the arrangement. Then came Catherine Howard, young, lively, and disastrously unfaithful. She was executed after less than 2 years as queen. Finally, Catherine Parr, more nurse than lover, soothed Henry in his declining years, surviving him and living on after his death. By the end of his reign in 1547, Henry VIII was no longer the golden prince of his youth. Bloated, plagued by sores, carried about on a special chair, he nonetheless left a transformed kingdom. England was cut off from Rome, monasteries smashed, royal power enhanced, and the idea of the monarch as supreme authority in religion and state firmly established. His son, Edward VI, inherited at just 9 years old. A sickly boy, he reigned for only 6 years. Under the guidance of his regents, England was pushed deeper into Protestantism. The Book of Common Prayer was introduced, churches stripped of decoration, and Catholic practices suppressed. When Edward died at 15, the kingdom faced another crisis. Briefly, Lady Jane Grey, known as the 9 Days Queen, was thrust onto the throne by Protestant nobles. She was swiftly deposed, and the crown passed to Mary, Henry's eldest daughter. Mary I was determined to return England to Catholicism. She married Philip of Spain and launched a campaign of persecution, burning nearly 300 Protestants at the stake. To her enemies, she was Bloody Mary. To her supporters, she was a devout defender of the true faith. Either way, her reign was short, ending with her death in 1558. The throne then passed to Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, who would rule for 45 years. Elizabeth I was a queen of immense intelligence, political skill, and stagecraft. She re-established Protestantism, but allowed a middle way, a broad church that left enough space for most people to muddle along without too much complaint. Her reign became known as a golden age. Sleep's oration flourished. Francis Drake circumnavigated the globe. Walter Raleigh brought back tobacco and potatoes, though one suspects they caused as much coughing and indigestion as delight. Literature too blossomed. Shakespeare, Marlowe and Spenser gave England plays and poetry of dazzling brilliance. Yet Elizabeth's reign was also marked by danger. Catholic plots threatened her life, and rebellions flared in Ireland. The great crisis came in 1588, when Philip II of Spain launched the Armada. A fleet of mighty warships set sail to conquer England and restore Catholic rule. The English navy, smaller but nimble, harried the Armada in the Channel. Storms scattered it. Elizabeth, addressing her troops at Tilbury, declared she had the body of a weak and feeble woman, but the heart and stomach of a king. It was theatre, but it worked. England had survived. By the time Elizabeth died in 1603, she was celebrated as Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, a monarch who had presided over peace, prosperity, and the flowering of culture. But she died childless, ending the Tudor line. The crown passed to her cousin, James VI of Scotland, uniting the two kingdoms under a single monarch, and ushering in the Stuart era. The Tudors then left behind a changed nation. They had broken England's ties to Rome, strengthened the monarchy, encouraged exploration and culture, and laid the groundwork for empire. They had also, quite unintentionally, given future generations a handy rhyme about Henry's wives. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. A dynasty of drama, spectacle and transformation, they remain even today the most famous family ever to sit on the English throne. When Elizabeth I died in 1603, the crown passed to her cousin James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England. For the first time, England and Scotland shared a monarch, though not yet a single government. James fancied himself a man of learning, fond of theological debates, and convinced of the divine right of kings, the notion that monarchs ruled because God said so. Unfortunately for him, not everyone else was so convinced. James's reign is remembered for both cultural flourishing and growing tension. Shakespeare was still writing, the King James Bible was published in 1611, and tobacco smoke wafted through court corridors. But beneath the surface, religion caused division. Catholics plotted against him, most famously in 1605, when Guy Fawkes and his fellow conspirators tried to blow up Parliament in the Gunpowder Plot. Discovered just in time, the plotters were executed in grisly fashion, and the tradition of bonfires and fireworks on the 5th of November was born. His son, Charles I, inherited the throne in 1625, bringing with him even more threat. Charles believed passionately in the divine right of kings. Parliament, meanwhile, increasingly believed he was wrong. He married a Catholic queen, raised taxes without consent, and dismissed Parliament when it displeased him. The rift grew wider, and England slid towards conflict. By 1642, words had failed. Civil war broke out between the royalists or cavaliers who supported the king and the parliamentarians or roundheads led by figures like Oliver Cromwell. The fighting was fierce, with battles at Edgehill, Marston Moor and Naseby. Slowly, Parliament gained the upper hand, thanks in no small part to Cromwell's disciplined new model army. In 1649, Charles was captured, tried for treason and executed outside the banqueting house in Whitehall. For the first time, a reigning English monarch had been legally killed by his own people. Shock rippled across Europe. The monarchy was abolished, and England became a republic, the Commonwealth. Cromwell emerged as its dominant figure, ruling first as general and later as Lord Protector. A stern Puritan, he enforced moral discipline with gusto. Theatres closed, Christmas celebrations banned, and alehouses frowned upon. To many, Cromwell's rule felt like joyless tyranny, though he did strengthen the army and expand England's influence abroad. Cromwell died in 1658, and without his iron will, the Republic faltered. 2 years later, in 1660, the monarchy was restored, and Charles II, son of the executed king, returned to London in triumph. The Restoration brought a wave of relief and revelry. Theatres reopened, fashions brightened, and Charles, charming, witty, and fond of mistresses, gave the court a reputation for decadence. London itself, however, suffered tragedy. In 1665, the Great Plague swept the city, killing tens of thousands. The following year, the Great Fire of London consumed much of the medieval city, leaving only smouldering ruins. From the ashes, however, rose a new city, with Christopher Wren's magnificent St. Paul's Cathedral as its crown. Charles died in 1685, succeeded by his brother James II. James was openly Catholic, a problem in a kingdom that had settled uneasily into Protestant identity. When he produced a Catholic heir, alarm bells rang. A group of nobles invited William of Orange, husband of James's Protestant daughter Mary, to intervene. William landed with an army in 1688, but there was barely a fight. James fled, and William and Mary were crowned joint monarchs. This was the Glorious Revolution. Glorious because almost no blood was shed, and revolutionary because Parliament insisted on a new settlement. The Bill of Rights of 1689 limited royal power, confirmed parliamentary supremacy, and established principles that would shape Britain's constitutional monarchy. The age of absolute monarchs was over. The Stuarts lingered on, with Mary's sister Anne eventually taking the throne, but the balance of power had shifted decisively. By 1714, when Anne died without an heir, the Stuart line came to an end. The crown passed to the Hanoverians, a German dynasty with only the vaguest notion of Englishness. Britain was now a constitutional monarchy, its politics dominated by Parliament, and its kings and queens expected to behave with more restraint than Charles I had ever imagined. The Stuart century had seen plots, war, execution, republic, restoration, plague, fire, and revolution. Out of it all came a new settlement, a monarchy tamed, a parliament emboldened, and a kingdom transformed. When Queen Anne died in 1714 without an heir, the crown passed to her nearest Protestant relatives, the Hanoverians of Germany. Thus, Britain gained its first king who barely spoke English, George I. He preferred German conversation and German company, and seemed to view Britain as a somewhat inconvenient side hustle. His son, George II, wasn't much better at charming his subjects, though he at least led troops into battle at Dettingen in 1743, the last British monarch to fight personally on the battlefield. What these early Georges lacked in charisma, they compensated for by ushering in an age of political change. Real power increasingly shifted to Parliament and to ministers like Robert Walpole, often described as Britain's first Prime Minister. While kings fretted over court gossip, politicians debated taxes, trade and war, laying the foundations of the parliamentary system we still recognise today. But Britain in the 18th century was not just about Whigs and Westminster. It was an age of enlightenment. Coffeehouses buzzed with debate. Pamphlets circulated new ideas, and scientists and thinkers pushed the boundaries of knowledge. Isaac Newton had already redefined physics. Later came men like James Watt, whose improvements to the steam engine would help launch the Industrial Revolution. Inventions, discoveries and ideas flowed as never before, and Britain began to look less like a sleepy island and more like a global powerhouse in the making. Of course, global power required a global presence. The Royal Navy, strengthened and expanded, became the backbone of British might. Ships carried goods, soldiers and settlers across the oceans. Colonies spread in the Americas, Africa and Asia. With trade came wealth, but also exploitation. The Atlantic slave trade, in which millions of Africans were transported in horrific conditions to the Americas, became a central pillar of Britain's economy. Ports like Liverpool and Bristol grew rich, while the human cost was staggering beyond measure. The century was punctuated by wars as Britain grappled with rivals, especially France. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, was global in scope, fought in Europe, North America, the Caribbean, India and beyond. Britain emerged victorious, gaining Canada, dominance in India and a reputation as the preeminent naval power. Yet victory came at a price, and the bill for empire would soon arrive. That bill landed in the American colonies. Taxes, trade restrictions, and a sense of neglect fueled resentment. In 1776, 13 colonies declared independence, and Britain found itself facing a revolution. The war was long, bitter, and humiliating for the mother country. Despite early hopes, the colonies broke free, giving birth to the United States of America. It was a bruising loss, but not a fatal one. Britain turned its gaze to India, the Caribbean, Africa, and later Australasia, and the empire not only endured but expanded. Back home, Georgian Britain was a land of contrasts. At one end, glittering wealth, Georgian townhouses with elegant facades, fashionable assemblies in Bath, Handel's music echoing in London halls. At the other, grinding poverty, slums, gin shops, child labour and disease. The Industrial Revolution was beginning to transform society, drawing people into smoky new factory towns, reshaping landscapes and altering lives in ways no one yet fully understood. The later Georgian era also witnessed political upheaval, inspired by revolution abroad. The French Revolution of 1789 and the rise of Napoleon shook Europe. Britain, alarmed at the spread of radical ideas, became locked in long wars with revolutionary and Napoleonic France. Naval victories, such as Nelson's triumph at Trafalgar in 1805, cemented Britain's dominance at sea. But the shadow of Napoleon loomed large until his final defeat at Waterloo in 1815. By the close of the Georgian Age, Britain had changed profoundly. It had lost one empire in America, but gained another in Asia and elsewhere. It had seen the beginnings of industrial society, witnessed new political debates about rights and representation, and established itself as the greatest naval power in the world. The Hanoverian Georges themselves may not have been the most thrilling monarchs, but under their watch Britain became something altogether different. Not just a kingdom, but a burgeoning empire and a workshop of industry. The stage was set for the 19th century, when Queen Victoria would preside over an empire so vast that it was said the sun never set upon it. But before Victoria, there would be reform, factories, and the full force of the Industrial Revolution to grapple with. When William IV died in 1837, the crown passed to his young niece, an 18-year-old girl named Victoria. Few could have imagined she would reign for more than 60 years, lending her name to an entire age. From the innocence of her youth to the black-clad widowhood of her later years, Victoria became the very symbol of Britain's 19th century. Her reign coincided with a transformation unlike any in the nation's history. The Industrial Revolution, which had begun in the Georgian era, now gathered unstoppable pace. Steam engines powered trains that shrieked across the countryside. Factories belched smoke over expanding cities, and new inventions, telegraphs, photography, electricity, shrank the world and changed daily life. Britain became known as the workshop of the world. Iron bridges spanned rivers. Locomotives thundered down new railways, and entire towns mushroomed around coal mines and textile mills. The wealth generated was staggering, but it was unevenly shared. For every mill owner growing rich, there were countless factory workers labouring in grim conditions, children crawling under looms, families crammed into filthy slums. Reformers raised their voices, demanding change. The Chartists campaigned for universal male suffrage, trade unions emerged, and social reform gradually took shape. Acts of Parliament began to improve working hours, limit child labour, and expand education. Meanwhile, the empire reached its zenith. By mid-century, British redcoats marched on nearly every continent, and the Union Jack flew over vast territories. In India, Canada, Australia, Africa and the Caribbean, Britain expanded its power. The empire was justified in lofty language of civilization and progress, but beneath it lay greed, conquest and exploitation. The Great Exhibition of 1851, held in the glittering Crystal Palace in Hyde Park, showcased the marvels of industry and empire to the world. It was a proud moment, a glass cathedral to Victorian achievement, but also a symbol of imperial confidence that sometimes shaded into arrogance. Not all imperial ventures went smoothly. In 1857, the Indian Rebellion challenged British rule, leading to brutal reprisals and the end of East India Company control. India came directly under the crown, and Victoria was later proclaimed Empress of India, a title that bound her name to the jewel of the empire. In Africa, explorers and missionaries ventured inland, paving the way for future conquest. The empire both enriched and entangled Britain, drawing it into conflicts far from home. At home, Victoria's reign was also a story of politics. Early in her rule, She relied heavily on her beloved husband, Prince Albert, whose influence was profound. Albert championed education, science, and the arts, and his death in 1861 devastated the Queen. She wore black for the rest of her life, retreating from public view for years, though she eventually re-emerged as a national figurehead. Prime ministers like Benjamin Disraeli and William Gladstone dominated politics, their rivalry shaping government as Britain inched towards greater democracy. The Reform Acts of 1832, 1867 and 1884 gradually expanded the right to vote, laying the groundwork for modern parliamentary democracy. Victorian Britain was also an age of ideas and contradictions. Religion remained powerful, yet science surged forward. Darwin's theory of evolution shocked and thrilled. Philanthropy flourished alongside grinding poverty. Respectability and prudery coexisted with vice and hypocrisy. The Victorians built railways, libraries and sewer systems, but also tolerated child labour and appalling inequality. They were a people of progress and paradox. By the time Victoria died in 1901, her empire was the largest the world had ever seen, and Britain was a global superpower. Yet cracks were appearing. Other nations, Germany, the United States, were rising fast. The costs of empire were mounting, and the world was growing restless. The long Victorian century had given Britain unmatched wealth and power, but it had also sown the seeds of future challenges. Victoria herself, however, remained adored by her people, remembered as the grandmother of Europe, the matriarch of a sprawling dynasty that married into royal families across the continent. Her funeral was one of the grandest ever seen, closing not just a reign, but an era. The world she left behind was modern, industrial, imperial, and very much poised on the brink of the turbulent 20th century. When Queen Victoria died in 1901, the world mourned. Not just a monarch, but the end of an era. Her long reign had stretched across most of the century, and her passing felt like the closing of a vast, weighty book. Her son, Edward VII, took the throne, inaugurating the Edwardian Age, a time of elegance, motor cars and optimism. Yet beneath the glamour, the tensions of the modern world were already simmering. The Edwardian years saw Britain at its imperial peak, but cracks were beginning to show. Rival powers, especially Germany and the United States, were rising fast. The suffragette movement was growing louder, demanding votes for women. Industrial unrest rattled the cities as workers demanded fairer pay and better conditions. And across Europe, alliances and rivalries were laying the kindling for an inferno. In 1914, the spark was lit. The assassination of an archduke in Sarajevo drew Europe into war, and Britain was pulled in through treaty obligations. The First World War engulfed the nation. Millions of men marched to the trenches of France, where mud, barbed wire and machine guns turned battlefields into slaughterhouses. The Somme, Passchendaele, Ypres, names that became bywords for horror. On the home front, women filled factories, producing shells and uniforms, keeping the nation running while husbands and brothers fought abroad. By 1918, victory came, but at an appalling cost. Nearly 1 million British soldiers were dead, and the economy strained. The empire still stood, but it was shaken. In Ireland, unrest exploded into rebellion and civil war, leading to independence for the South in 1921. At home, women finally won the vote, first partially and then fully by 1928. Society was changing irreversibly. The interwar years brought both hope and hardship. The 1920s had their glamour, jazz, cinemas, motor cars, and the birth of broadcasting. Yet the 1930s saw economic depression, unemployment, and the ominous rise of dictators abroad. Many Britons dreaded another war. Yet by 1939 it could not be avoided. Hitler's invasion of Poland brought Britain once more into conflict. The Second World War tested the nation as nothing else had. The Blitz rained fire on London and other cities, entire streets reduced to rubble. Families sheltered in underground stations, while Churchill's speeches steeled morale. On the battlefields, from El Alamein to Normandy, British troops fought with allies to push back the tide of fascism. By 1945, victory was won, but again at a terrible price. Cities lay in ruins, the economy exhausted, and the empire, stretched to breaking point, began to unravel. The post-war years brought dramatic change. In 1948, the National Health Service was founded, a symbol of the new welfare state. At the same time, Britain shed much of its empire. India became independent in 1947, followed by nations across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. The Union Jack was lowered in territory after territory, as Britain adjusted to a new role in a rapidly changing world. Yet the nation also experienced renewal. The 1950s and 60s saw economic growth, rising living standards, and cultural shifts. Rock and roll, the Beatles, fashion revolutions, and the so-called swinging 60s made Britain seem suddenly young and vibrant. London became the capital of cool. Immigration from the Caribbean, South Asia, and Africa enriched society, though it also brought tensions as old prejudices surfaced. By the 1970s, challenges returned: strikes, inflation, and political turmoil. The winter of discontent saw rubbish piled in the streets and a sense of national decline. Then came Margaret Thatcher, Britain's first female Prime Minister, elected in 1979. Her free market policies, battles with trade unions, and strong stance abroad, especially during the Falklands War, divided opinion but reshaped the nation. Some praised her for revitalising the economy. Others condemned her for widening inequality and dismantling industry. The final decades of the century were marked by transition. The Cold War ended, bringing relief but also uncertainty. Britain debated its place in Europe, joining the European community but remaining ambivalent. In 1997, Tony Blair's New Labour swept to power, promising modernisation and delivering reforms like Scottish and Welsh devolution. That same year, Britain mourned the death of Princess Diana, whose funeral revealed both deep affection for the monarchy and simmering frustration with its distance. By 1999, Britain was a very different place from the Edwardian splendour of 1901. The empire was gone, replaced by a commonwealth of nations. Society had been transformed by 2 world wars, by migration, by cultural revolutions. The monarchy had survived, though it had changed. The economy had shifted from factories to finance and services. Britain, battered but resilient, had entered the modern age. The 20th century was a story of loss and renewal, tragedy and triumph. It left scars that remain visible, but also laid the groundwork for the Britain of today. As the new millennium dawned, Britain entered the 21st century with optimism. The year 2000 brought celebrations, fireworks over the Thames, and a giant Ferris wheel the London Eye, as a symbol of modernity. The Cold War was over, the economy was booming, and it seemed, for a moment, that the nation had stepped into a bright new era. Tony Blair's new Labour government embodied that sense of renewal. In 1999, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland gained devolved parliaments and assemblies, reshaping the United Kingdom into a looser, more complex union. The Good Friday Agreement of 1998 had brought relative peace to Northern Ireland after decades of conflict, and for many this felt like a hopeful beginning. Britain also embraced a new international role, supporting interventions abroad, most controversially in Iraq in 2003, a decision that divided the nation and left scars on politics for years to come. At home, the early years of the century were marked by confidence. The 2012 London Olympics provided a moment of national pride, blending pageantry with humour, from Shakespeare's Tempest to James Bond escorting the Queen to the stadium, and even a surprise parachute by Mr. Bean. Britain seemed, briefly, both global and playful, rooted in tradition but confident in the modern world. Yet, beneath the surface, questions of identity and belonging grew louder. Immigration increased, enriching culture but sparking debate. Scotland debated independence, holding a referendum in 2014 in which a majority voted to remain in the United Kingdom, though the issue did not go away. And then came the most divisive decision of all, Brexit. In 2016, a referendum on membership of the European Union split the country almost evenly. The vote to leave unleashed years of political wrangling, prime ministers rising and falling, and deep arguments over what Britain's place in the world should be. Meanwhile, the monarchy itself entered a new chapter. Queen Elizabeth II, who had reigned since 1952, remained a symbol of continuity into the 21st century. Her jubilees were celebrated with pomp and affection, even as the institution faced scrutiny and controversy. In 2022, her death ended the Second Elizabethan Age, ushering in the reign of her son, Charles III. The monarchy endured, but Britain was no longer the world-straddling power of Victoria's time. Rather, it was a modern nation, grappling with questions of relevance and identity. Culturally, Britain remained influential. Music, film and literature carried global weight, from Harry Potter to Adele. The Internet reshaped daily life, as it did everywhere. Social changes continued. The legalization of same-sex marriage in 2014 marked a significant milestone, while debates over climate change, inequality and technology defined much of the public conversation. The 21st century has also tested resilience. The 2008 financial crisis shook the economy. Terrorist attacks in London brought tragedy and fear. The COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 brought lockdowns, loss, and a new appreciation for the NHS. Through it all, Britain adapted, sometimes grudgingly, sometimes creatively, always with a sense of muddling through. And so here Britain stands today, a nation of contradictions, no longer the empire of old, but still carrying echoes of its past. A place of tradition and innovation, division and resilience. Its future is uncertain. But then, history has never been about certainty. It has always been about change. And Britain, for all its quirks, remains adept at weathering change. As the 21st century unfolds, the story continues, not with swords and castles, but with debates in parliaments, arguments on social media, and the quiet, steady rhythm of everyday life. And perhaps, as always, with a good cup of tea. And so we have travelled the long road of Britain's history, from mammoths on Doggerland to motor cars in Edwardian London, from Druids at Stonehenge to Brexit debates in Parliament, from Henry VIII's bustling court to Queen Elizabeth II's long farewell. It has been a journey of kingdoms and empires, wars and revolutions, poems and pop songs, triumphs and disasters, all woven into the fabric of these islands. What strikes one, drifting through the centuries, is not just the great events, the Magna Carta, the Armada, the Blitz, but the persistence of ordinary life. Through it all, farmers tilled fields, children played in village lanes, workers crowded into factories, and families shared tea around their tables. The mighty sweep of history was built on the quiet endurance of countless lives, most unrecorded, yet each part of the story. Britain today is no longer the world-straddling empire of Victoria, nor the embattled fortress of Churchill. It is instead a modern nation, still proud of its traditions, still wrestling with its future, still capable of producing Shakespearean drama in the form of politics. The past lingers everywhere, in the stones of castles, in the rituals of Parliament, in the language itself, a patchwork of Saxon, Norse, French, and everything in between. As you settle into sleep, perhaps what lingers is not the names of kings or the dates of battles, but the sense of continuity. These islands have endured ice and fire, invaders and revolutions, prosperity and poverty. And yet, through it all, Britain remains. Sometimes divided, sometimes defiant, often eccentric, but always there. And so I leave you with a question to carry into your dreams. Was Britain's greatest legacy its empire, its democracy, its literature, or something far simpler? The quiet art of muddling through. Good night.